All right, let's talk about AI, but maybe not in the way you're thinking. We're going to look at its history, and trust me, it's a total roller coaster. We're talking about these massive booms, followed by these sudden, freezing collapses. It's a wild ride, so let's dive right in. Okay, get this, $50 billion. That's not the total. That's just how much was invested in AI in 2022 alone. I mean, it's hard not to feel like we're in this incredible golden age, right? An AI boom that's just changing, well, everything. And you see it everywhere. You've got ChatGPT writing essays. You've got this dream of self-driving cars just around the corner. AI has just never felt this powerful, this real in our day-to-day lives. The excitement level is, it's just off the charts. But you have to wonder, right? Is the hype maybe getting a little out of control? Because here's the thing. If you look back at the history of AI, you realize this isn't the first gold rush, not by a long shot. And these boons, well, they have a nasty habit of being followed by a bust, a really bad one, a kind of deep freeze they call an AI winter. And that term, AI winter, is actually pretty fascinating. It was coined way back in 1984 by a couple of top researchers. And they were basically giving a warning. They said, look, if this hype gets out of control, it's going to trigger this chain reaction, kind of like a nuclear winter, but for research. First the press turns negative, then the funding gets yanked, and then poof, all the serious research just grinds to a halt. And you know what? They were spot on. Okay, so let's rewind. Let's go all the way back to that first big cycle. The scene is the Cold War, and the big, shiny dream for AI was this thing called machine translation. The US government, especially folks like the CIA, were just dumping money into this research. And they had a super clear goal. They wanted to automatically translate Russian documents, scientific papers, you name it, and they wanted it done instantly. Can you imagine? The optimism at the start was just immense. So how did that go? Well, there's this famous example. It might be a legend, but it perfectly explains the problem. They supposedly fed a machine the sentence, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." It translated it into Russian, then back to English. The result? The vodka is good, but the meat is rotten. Right? It just shows how badly researchers underestimated what's called the common sense knowledge problem. A machine can know a million words, but it doesn't get context. It doesn't understand nuance, or all that unspoken stuff that we humans just know. And then the dominoes started to fall. Fast. You had this series of really high-profile reports that just exposed all the flaws. First, this thing called the ALPAC report comes out in '66, and it's just a huge blow to machine translation. Then a book, Perceptrons, comes out and basically proves, with math, that the early neural networks, the very foundation of AI, were shockingly limited. Over in the UK, the Lighthill report was so brutal, it basically shut down AI research. And then the big one. DARPA, the biggest funder in the game, just starts pulling the plug. And just like that, the first AI winter was here. Look at this. This photo really says it all. That's the Vice President of the United States getting a personal demo of an AI model. The interest went right to the top. And yet, less than a year later, the funding just vanished. That's how fast the weather can change in the world of AI. But, winter doesn't last forever. Things thawed out, and by the 1980s, the hype came roaring back. This time, though, it wasn't about government spies. It was all about the corporate world and this hot new tech that was promising to completely change how business was done. So the big buzzword this time around was expert systems. The idea was pretty cool, actually. You build these programs that could mimic the decision-making of a real human expert, like a doctor diagnosing a disease or a geologist finding oil. You could literally capture an expert's brain in a machine. And this thing exploded. It became a billion-dollar industry, with companies building these super expensive, specialized computers called LISP machines just to run them. But, sound familiar? Once again, the promise just didn't quite match the reality. The key thing to understand is that these systems were incredibly brittle. So yeah, they worked fine in their little narrow boxes, but the second you gave them something slightly unusual, they'd just break and give you some bizarre, nonsensical answer. At the end of the day, they were really just super complicated flowcharts. They couldn't learn on their own, and trying to update them, it was a total nightmare, incredibly complex and expensive. And the collapse, when it came, was just as fast and even more total. Those super expensive LISP machines, they basically became obsolete overnight, replaced by powerful desktop computers. At the same time, this huge project in Japan to build human-like AI, it just fizzled out. And then, yep, you guessed it, DARPA stepped in and cut the funding, deeply and brutally, as they said. And that was it. The second and much longer AI winter had begun. So what happens next is actually my favorite part of the story. It's so interesting. After that second crash, the actual term AI became toxic. I mean, so toxic that researchers basically had to take their work underground. Yeah, this quote from the New York Times just nails it. It says it all. If you were a researcher and you wanted to get funding for your project, the last thing you would do is call it AI. No way. You'd call it machine learning or data analytics or knowledge-based systems, literally anything else to avoid being seen as one of those wild-eyed dreamers from the past. And here's the crazy irony of the whole thing. While the brand name AI was completely dead, the actual technology was quietly becoming more successful than ever before. It was being baked into all sorts of systems for things like logistics and data mining and all this other stuff. But nobody was calling it AI. Just like the researcher Rodney Brooks said, AI hadn't failed at all. It had just become invisible. Okay, so all of that brings us right back to today. We are, without a doubt, in the middle of the biggest AI boom in history. So after this little trip down memory lane, what have we actually learned? Well, it's taught us that there's a pattern, a really clear repeating pattern, right? It all starts with massive hype and optimism. That leads to these huge overblown promises. Then comes the reality check, when everyone realizes, oh wait, this is actually way harder than we thought. That brings on disappointment and criticism, and then, boom, the funding collapses. This exact cycle has been playing out for over 70 years. Now, don't get me wrong, the progress we're seeing today is absolutely staggering. It's on a whole other level from what those early pioneers could have even dreamed of. But the hype is also at an all-time high. So the million-dollar question, or maybe the $50 billion question, is this. Have we finally learned enough from history to break the cycle this time? Or are we just setting ourselves up for another long, cold winter?